got a chance to talk a little bit about Bloom. You got to see a little bit of a video about it. And the work that we are doing is definitely making impact. It's working, right? And we want to make sure that you can understand the why behind all of it. And so I want to bring to the stage a gentleman who has helped shape some of our work with his life course framework for young black men as a centerpiece, as the work that we're doing in the Alliance. And today he's going to be presenting the meaning-based interventions to help close racial gaps in adolescent and young adult outcomes. Mr. Arnold Chandler.
Today's presentation is the product of a research study that I did looking at interventions that specifically promote intergenerational mobility for Black, Latino, Native American, and Pacific Islander populations. And I was looking at what factors we need to change and what interventions have been shown in randomized controlled trials to affect the critical outcomes necessary to promote long-term improvement in those outcomes. And in the process of doing that study, it's like 200 pages long. It'll come out in a couple weeks, or actually a couple months. So you'll be able to see it then, but I'll just have to kind of preview it for you. But one of the things that emerged, to my surprise, when I conducted a scan of interventions that promote the key milestones to upward intergenerational mobility. And intergenerational mobility, by the way, is doing better than your parents. So we look at a lot of interventions to see if kids are improving on what they were doing before. But the primary determinant on where kids end up in their lives is where their parents ended up. And so how do we break that gravitational pull of a prior generation? And so that's the question I'm looking at, is how do we move, say, poor kids out of poverty into a space of opportunity? But more importantly, how do we prevent kids who are in the middle class, say, from falling? The majority of Black and Latino, the majority of Black boys and girls and Latino American Indian boys and girls fall out of the middle class. I don't know if you guys know that. The majority do. So generation after generation, we're not closing these gaps. These gaps are remaining stable, and some generations, they're growing. And so in looking at that question, I tried to find out what interventions exist to try and address this problem. And what puzzled me and what was remarkable about this is that interventions that focus on meaning tend to be the types of interventions that are A, most likely to affect outcomes for kids of color, B, more likely to disproportionately affect positively for kids of color, meaning they do better than white kids do when you administer this intervention. They have larger effect sizes. And third, the effects last longer. They last several years, not just 4 months or 6 months or at the pre or post test. And so that's where this presentation came from, is this discovery. I want to start first with the idea that racism is a meaning system that suppresses latent ability. If you were at the session yesterday, which I wasn't, so I don't know fully what he covered, but he talked about implicit bias. Implicit bias is the unconscious beliefs you hold about other people. What I'm going to talk about is the unconscious beliefs we hold about ourselves, if we are Black or Latino or a woman, and how that unconscious belief that we may even consciously reject suppresses our latent ability. It suppresses our ability to perform up to what we're actually capable of doing. And these meaning-based interventions, it turns out, respond to this. And in order to get there, I have to talk about racism. And racism inherently as a meaning system that gets in our unconscious minds. I'm going to present meaning interventions, and some of the meaning interventions have been actually shown to counteract the underlying thing that's going on that racism produces that undermines our ability, and that's referred to as stereotype threat. Others, influence meaning, have similar substantial outcomes, but it's not necessarily attached to stereotype threat per se. But kids of color disproportionately benefit, and so I lift those up here. But all the ones that I'm going to highlight are focused on meaning, altering meaning, and I'll explain what that means more in just a second. Racism as a meaning system, I'm sorry, I've been one slide behind this whole time, I apologize. Racism is a meaning system that suppresses latent ability. Now, racism, we know of, if you heard the term structural racism or systemic racism or institutional racism, that is about institutions and structures in the broader way that opportunity is structured in our society. But at its core is a set of meanings. It's a constellation of reinforcing ideas and beliefs that are organized around a hierarchy of human value. These beliefs can get inside of us, inside of our psychology, and it can affect us and influence us even when we consciously reject them emphatically. So you can say to yourself, I know that black people are not less intelligent than white people. And you can consciously, emphatically believe that, but your unconscious doesn't agree with you. It doesn't agree with your belief that you consciously hold, and it works against you. But the people who are most vulnerable for it to work against them are kids, young children, and adolescents. We can see this phenomenon play out when we look at how college students solve puzzles. This is a randomized controlled trial study that used something called Raven's progressive matrices, and they had this example of a puzzle. This is a, I forget what the name of this, logical reasoning puzzle or something like that. I forget what the type of puzzle is. But if you looked at this, and that empty space is one of those down at the bottom are supposed to go there. And what I want you to do is make a mental note of what you think the answer is. Just look at 1 through 8. Don't panic. This is not actually a test, but look at 1 through 8. Pick what you think is the right answer that you think goes in there, and then just make a mental note of it before I reveal the answer. Okay, now I'm going to reveal the answer. So the one that goes in there is 3. So if you got it, you were right. If you were wrong, no one knows you're wrong, so it doesn't matter. Now, this was used in an experimental study conducted with college students, American college students, 59 African American students, 83 white students, enrolled in a college psychology class. And what this study was trying to test is what effect producing stereotype threat would have on the performance of black kids relative to white kids. And the way they triggered this effect is they called this, in the low threat condition where there was no or low stereotype threat, they told the students that the task you will be working on is a series of puzzles. Please take the puzzles seriously. When you are finished working on the puzzles, we would like to ask you some questions about the puzzles and get your thoughts and reactions about them. So pretty banal. However, in the high threat condition, they were told, this is an IQ test. This is judging your intelligence. That is what Raven's progressive matrices actually are. They are popularly used IQ tests. The task you will be working on is an IQ test. Like the SAT and ACT, this test frequently is used to measure individuals' intelligence and ability. So what happened for students who were in the low threat condition compared to the high threat condition? Well, in the high threat condition, where the kids were told that this was an IQ test, black students scored 25% lower than white students on those tests. However, in the condition in which they were told there were puzzles, there was no difference in the scores between white and black students. The effect was unconsciously triggered by the fact that they were told that this was a diagnostic test of intelligence. And this happens throughout our lives, but the place where it's rife is in schools. This is an education for all the 12 years of K through 12, or 13 years of K through 12, and then the 4 or 6 or 8 years of college and post-college. The mechanism that explains the gap between these two outcomes for black students in the high threat and the low threat condition is what's referred to as stereotype threat. And it's a fear that we might confirm negative stereotypes about our group, and it's a fear that operates primarily unconsciously. We don't even know it's happening. Two researchers, two social psychologists have conducted a meta-analysis. This is a study that takes several studies and tries to aggregate up all those quantitative studies to a single finding. And what they found in this study called Latent Ability, Grades and Test Scores Systematically Underestimate the Intellectual Ability of Negatively Stereotyped Students, they found with a meta-analysis of 16,000 students across these combined studies that stereotype threat suppresses test scores and grades of threatened students by around 1/5 of a standard deviation. Which, if you know educational research and intervention research, that is a large effect size. And this is just for stereotype threat. This is not including poverty. This is not including trauma. This is not including all the other things that we know kids of color bring with them through their lives as they go off to college or transit through K through 12. This is the isolated effect of just stereotype threat, of just the idea that your race interacts with the challenge you're doing and suppresses your ability. If you want to know how this translates to the SAT, it's about 20% of the black-white test score gap and around 27% of the Latino-white test score gap. So there's a great book by the originator of this idea, Claude Still, who is the creator of the notion of stereotype threat, called Whistling Vivaldi: How Do the Effects of Stereotype Threat Occur? And Whistling Vivaldi is a funny story of the name of that title of that book. It's about a doctoral researcher at the University of Chicago who lived in a nice neighborhood in Chicago, and he would always walk home late at night from his lab around 11 o'clock, and he's like 6'5", like 250 pounds. And so he kept noticing when he would walk home to his neighborhood, through his nice neighborhood, that he would scare white people. It just kept happening. So he decided, and it was stressing him out every time he would walk through his neighborhood, that he was going to scare white people. So what he started doing is whistling Vivaldi, which is a classical musician, and his theory was, how can you be scared of a black man whistling Vivaldi walking through a neighborhood at 11 o'clock at night? And the irony was that it reduced his stress levels, and it also reduced the stress levels of white folks he was interacting with. So it worked. It worked. And so he was basically recognizing that there was this process of interaction around the threat, the stereotype he represented to these people, and if he could stop that feedback loop, he could reduce his own stress and theirs. But in the book, Claude Still does a great job of explaining how this process of stereotype threat occurs. When our identities are threatened by a stereotype, our bodies respond at an unconscious level beyond our awareness. Our minds race, heart rate increases, blood pressure rises. Physiological signs of anxiety start to appear. Our cognitive load is redirected to rumination or worry about confirming the stereotype, meaning our brain is reallocating effort. And when they've done functional MRI scans to see what happens for people who are experiencing this, activity in the part of the brain that we use to solve cognitive problems is decreased, and activity in the part of the brain associated with vigilance towards threats in our environment and social cues that signal those threats, that increases. We're having an unconscious fight or flight response. The interesting thing about this is that when they ask people while this is happening if they're aware of it, they weren't. People don't know that this is actually occurring. They were only able to detect it when they hook them up through all the sensors and they can see it's occurring. So this is something you're not aware of that's happening to you when your identity is threatened in a way that will undermine your performance on outcomes. Now, the problem is not just that happens to you once and it's an isolated event. The problem is when it happens to you over time, consistently. It produces a process, a vicious cycle. The first part of the cycle is disengagement. You expend less cognitive effort and emotional connection on a task if you feel like it's confirming a stereotype, if the stereotype threat process is happening. After repeated disengagement, you start to do what's called task withdrawal. You would, excuse me, you withdraw from attempting to complete the task at all. I don't do stuff like that. That's not what I do. I'm not good at those things. And then eventually you have disidentification where you perceive yourself as not the type of person who's able to do those types of things at all. You completely disidentify. I'm just not good at math. I don't do math. That's kind of a death knell that a lot of us develop early on in adolescence. And that's a function of this experiencing happening over time. Once you get to the disidentification process, it's very hard to turn that around with tutoring or all the other types of interventions that you can administer, because what's happening is a meaning-based phenomena. It's not just really the person is incapable of excelling at those levels, it's that they've solidified the belief that they are not, and therefore, functionally, they are unable to live up to what they're able to do. That is the important distinction here. Meaning interventions came along, and meaning interventions built on that work of stereotype threat by Claude Still. One of the early ones was belonging intervention that you all may be familiar with, self-affirmation. I'm going to talk about all of them that I identified in this scan. Growth mindsets is one that also draws something from it. These are all meaning-based interventions, and I'll explain what I mean by meaning-based interventions compared to other types of interventions that exist. Now, if we want to close racial gaps in outcomes, not just improve outcomes for Black and Latino and American Indian kids, but close the gaps, we need interventions that not only work, they have to be effective. So RCT, or quasi-experimental evaluation, is preferred. And when I conducted this scan, these are the types of studies that I looked at. But they must be more effective for youth of color. They must produce larger effect sizes for Black, Latino, American Indian, Pacific Islander subgroups than they do for white students. But rarely do RCT evaluations test, one, do they even work equally well for all the racial subgroups? Do they work as well for Black kids as they do for white kids or as Latino kids? That's rarely tested. And also not tested is whether or not there is a subgroup difference where there's a bigger effect size for some of those subgroups compared to others. This is what I found in many of the scans. We ended up identifying something like over 350 interventions overall. Many of those interventions were excluded from our final list, which ended up being 63 for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is they don't look at how racial subgroups are performing with respect to the intervention. I conducted with some colleagues a scan of the what works literature for youth of color. And we wanted to identify specifically for ages 12 to 25, what potentially works better for that age range. We reviewed studies, hundreds of RCT evaluated interventions, focused on 20 key life course outcomes. If you've seen the life course framework, this was drawn from that. We ended up identifying 63 RCT evaluated interventions in total. Now, I wanted to give you the types of interventions that came through in this list. There's academic skills building interventions, teacher development interventions, social development mentorship interventions, meaning-based interventions, which we're going to talk a lot more about, therapeutic interventions, and therapeutic interventions involve someone who's had some type of clinical training. They usually involve some type of clinical modality in their approach, and so that's what's referred to there. Case management, array of supports. This could vary from formal case management to just a person who's a counselor who refers people to the 8 different programs that they are aware of, for example. That's the array of supports idea. And then last, employment programs, which were training programs usually aligned with sector pathways into jobs and so forth. So these comprised the 63 interventions that we found out of the 350 or so that we identified. And what was interesting, that of the 19 interventions that worked better for youth of color, 14 were meaning-based interventions. And when I saw that, I was like, whoa, what's going on here? Why these in particular? And I conducted a deeper dive into the background and understood that many of these interventions are based upon stereotype threat and were designed with the intent to try and neutralize stereotype threat to produce better outcomes. They were created with that in mind, and so for that reason, of course, they work better for kids of color. Meaning-based interventions are different from other types of interventions in terms of the human development aspects that they target. Programs target different aspects of human development. Some target cognitive development, which includes improving our IQ, which was primarily the focus of early childhood interventions, and then academic skills, reading, writing, math, and science. There's a lot out there. Tutoring is the common modality outside of classroom instruction to improve cognitive development. But then there's socio-emotional development, which is a broad category that includes a lot of things. It's been labeled non-cognitive, which was both problematic and conceptually, it's what an economist would call social psychological outcomes, unfortunately. But there's a lot of stuff that's been put in the category of socio-emotional development, from CABSE's framework on self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, responsible decision-making, personality traits like conscientiousness or grit, Grit has been argued through a few different studies to be a facet of conscientiousness, which is a personality trait, and not an independent entity unto itself, not an independent thing. For those who want to explore that more, I'm happy to take questions later and point you to the right studies on that. But for a variety of reasons, it suggests that grit is actually old wine in new bottles in some ways. And then strategies, metacognitive strategies, perseverance, and beliefs, self-efficacy. All of these things have been lumped in the category of socio-emotional, and they're all different types of things. Some are aspects of development, some are personality traits, some are techniques that people can deploy, some are beliefs. So it's a broad category, what's included there. And not all of these have been associated or studied in a systematic way to associate them with long-term educational outcomes. Once you get into the adolescent, early adulthood phase, then vocational knowledge and skills become important aspects of human development that are influenced by programs. Skills, specific capabilities needed to complete the tasks of a job, and knowledge, the body of facts, principles, and theories that are related to a field of work. The broad understanding of what goes into being in a certain type of field of practice. And then over here you have meaning making, a whole different animal from the first three. It's how people make sense of their actions and circumstances. It's primarily about how people's identity, the interpretation of people's identity in interaction with their context. And what these interventions do is they alter that. They don't build skills, they don't teach you things, and usually the effects occur unconsciously. They're not conscious products of intervention. These meaning-making aspects of human development are variously referred to as subjective construal, mindsets, causal attributions, and stories. This is the different animal that created the aha for me. That not only do you improve outcomes directly by these interventions, but it tends to make the other interventions that you might do, like tutoring, more effective. It makes kids engage with the tutoring differently. It produces an enhancement in help-seeking behavior amongst the kids. And so meaning making is an entirely different animal, a paradigm shift in many ways for me of intervention. What do meaning-based interventions do? The seminal article on this is Wise Interventions, Psychological Remedies for Social and Personal Problems. They alter meaning, alter specific ways people make sense of themselves or their situations. They change how our identity interacts with our context. They are particularly potent during life course transitions into new contexts, from middle school to high school, from high school to college, from college general to a major in college, to a first-time job. Each of these transitions is a critical and pivotal moment for the administration of meaning-based interventions that produced enduring effects through that period and actually post that period into later transitions. So if you start in middle school, interventions show the effects persist all the way up past college graduation. It improves outcomes only when other system supports are in place. So in a school, for example, where there's not a lot of supports available to kids of color, and a lot of the institutional behavior signals to kids of color that they are not as smart, or they are problematic or criminal or should be regulated through school-based police and other types of things, then even if you administer meaning-based interventions, their effects can be undermined by that context. You need a supportive context that works in favor of the intervention. And there's some pointers in the literature to what types of supportive contexts might be, but it's still a nascent aspect of the research. But what's remarkable about these meaning-based interventions is they produce snowballing effects in a lot of supportive contexts. And the snowballing happens both internally and externally. The internal effect is that if I take a meaning-based intervention and it improves my performance unexpectedly on a math test, I might perceive myself as being probably good at math, or maybe having potential to be good at math. And that produces a positive internal spiral for me. It makes me more likely to take other math tests or other challenging things, which further reaffirm that, yeah, I can do this. The external snowball effect is that when a teacher sees a kid perform well, they tend to treat that kid differently than other kids who don't perform well. They tend to reinforce, this is also referred to as the Pygmalion effect. They tend to develop expectations that that kid will do better and perform better over time. And both of these snowball effects have been shown to be a primary mechanism that causes these effects to persist for years. It's why they last a long time, because they build on each other. A lot of other interventions have high intensity of services and contact and relationship with a kid, but when that ends, the effects of that intervention start to fade. Meaning, and this is usually in RCTs determined by how the treatment and control group look like 6 months later or a year later. Usually you see a year later, there's no difference between the two groups. But in these studies of meaning-based interventions, you find differences a full decade later, there's still a sizable gap between the treatment and the control group. That recursivity, that persistence of effect is something that I only really saw emerge out of meaning-based interventions. Meaning-based interventions, also called mindset or WISE interventions, include the following interventions, and these are the names for these interventions. Self-affirmation, I found, was the most effective at closing, in particular, Black, white, and Latino white gaps in academic outcomes, grades and other types of outcomes. And this is about affirming valued identities and values. One of the things that I'm not going to get into, I took the slide out for lack of time, but there's a book called Handbook of Wise Interventions. The best book there is on these types of interventions. They wrote that book beautifully. They describe in detail the intervention. They show you how it's administered. They show you the research on its effectiveness, and they show you the theorized mechanisms of why they think it works. I encourage you to take a look at that if you want to understand more about how these interventions work. Self-affirmation, belonging to a valued group. Growth mindsets, having a growth or fixed mindset. So let me just tell you a bit about growth mindsets. Growth mindsets basically teaches kids that the brain is a muscle. And if you're doing something and you're struggling, that means the muscle's getting stronger. It doesn't mean that you're not up to the task or you're not smart. You're not the type of person who can do those things. When kids reframe struggle as they're getting smarter by working out the muscle, they tend to persist longer and overcome hurdles that would otherwise cause them to withdraw from the task and disidentify with that task, and they end up performing better over time. In terms of those interventions among these three, they show the largest racial gap closing potency, though. Self-affirmation and belonging are really what stand out. Rites of passage programs. You're going to hear a lot from those folks today. The Bloom organizations models that we talked about earlier, these are the types of models that are included there. Culturally based structured mentoring. Becoming a Man, SGLI, Brotherhood Crusade, Kingmakers of Oakland, all of these types of models operate on this similar types of rites of passage approach. Ethnic studies, culturally relevant to identity and experience. Sadly, ironically, at the moment in which ethnic studies had gained the most traction to get into K-12 education, someone invented the boogeyman of CRT, coming out of the Koch organization, no less, to try and push anything that mentions race out of public education. But we've seen these ethnic studies classes produce remarkable effects on academic achievement for kids of color in schools when they're included in public education, especially when they are semester-long or year-long courses. They're actually part of the academic curriculum. And then pathways to success, envisioning and aspiring to future possible selves. That's an intervention that's about kids in detail imagining the future person they want to be, mapping a path to that person, and then following that path over time with supports. These stand out as 6 of the most significant meaning-based interventions that I identified from the research literature. By the way, you guys will get these slides. They will send them out to you somehow. I'm sure you got a means. So anybody who feels like you missed a snapshot or something, don't worry, it'll come back out of the ether. The outcomes most impacted by meaning-based interventions are office referrals and suspensions, grades. Now, this was a shock to me. The only interventions that I found that improved grades on the entire, if you go to the Education What Works Clearinghouse, they have no interventions that improve grades. All the interventions they identify improve test scores, but test scores are poor predictors of how you will persist academically because grades are actually what determine your persistence. They determine what coursework you're going to move to next, whether or not you go to college, what college you will go to. That's shaped by grades, not test scores. And so what's remarkable is that meaning-based interventions are the only thing that improve middle and high school grades. Juvenile delinquency, BAM. Excuse me, BAM stands out here, as well as automaticity, CBT. High school graduation, college enrollment. These were all outcomes affected by these meaning-based interventions, all outcomes for which there were disproportionate benefits to Black, Latino, or American Indian students. Self-affirmation, for example, was shown at scale to cut the Black-white school suspension gap by 67% over 2 years in a large RCT. Now, I've studied school suspension issues a lot. School push-out, exclusionary school discipline. You know, we passed a law in California that got rid of willful defiance, among other things, that tried to scale back school suspensions. And the evidence tends to show it didn't work. I don't know if you guys seen some of the new studies that have looked at LA and other places. It didn't have the desired effect. There were either found other mechanisms and it didn't touch disparities. So it didn't affect disparities at all. However, this meaning-based intervention cut at scale across the school district, 2,000 kids. So this is the majority of kids in certain grades in a district. And it cut the black-white school suspension gap by 67%. Over 3 years, it reduced the gap in GPA by 10% between middle schoolers of color at scale in an RCT evaluation. Belonging cut the black-white gap in school discipline citations by 75% over 7 years. Now, this is a tiny study, but the study was launched when kids were in the 7th grade, and the reduction in school discipline gaps persisted all the way through the end of high school. So the persistence effect is what stands out here remarkably, and these other studies haven't been followed up long enough to see how their effects will persist, but my suspicion is you'll see the same type of dynamic play out. And then Becoming a Man reduced arrests for violent delinquency by 50% and increased high school graduation rates by 19%. In this RCT, AJ's back there, yeah, I don't want to put him on blast, but there is no effect size anywhere else in the educational intervention literature that has a 19 percentage point, or 19% improvement in high school graduation for Black and Latino males from high poverty schools living in ghetto neighborhoods. That's a stunning effect on high school graduation rates. Now, there are important differences in these types of interventions for how long they take to administer. One of the crazy things about self-affirmation, growth mindsets, belonging, is that these are typically interventions that last 1 to 2 hours of program time over 1 or 2 days, and that's it. And they have effects that last for years. Kids who have these persistent effects years later do not even remember taking the thing that they did to affect the outcomes. There's no recollection that belonging, I don't even know what you're talking about. So these things have disappeared from their memory, yet it has still produced a change in trajectory, as I call it, a fundamental life shift that's different in the treatment group compared to the control group. The ones that fall in this category are self-affirmation, belonging, growth mindset, expressive writing, and famous scientist struggles. There's a medium-length category. This is multiple sessions, 3 to 10 hours of program time over multiple weeks. Pathways to success, ethnic studies, my teaching partner secondary, empathic response to behavior. My teaching partner secondary and empathic response to behavior are unique. Both of them have dramatic effects on school discipline citations, but both of them are administered to teachers, not the students. And what they do is they basically disrupt teachers' unconscious appraisal of behavior as being endemic to a bad student. It changes their it gives them more compassion, other things, but it does so unconsciously. It causes them to reappraise the exact same behavior differently, and as a consequence, they are less likely to issue citations, in particular, to Black boys. And then there's the deep engagement. This is weekly sessions over 2+ years. Becoming a Man, Kingmakers of Oakland. These are the types of interventions that tend to be administered with more disadvantaged students. So one of the things that stands out in the literature is that when you look at the light touch interventions, like self-affirmation, like belonging, like growth mindset, and so forth, they've mostly been tested and evaluated in schools that didn't have really high poverty levels, that tended to have balanced racial mixes of the student population. It might be 50% white kids, 30 or 20% Black kids, 20 or 30% Latino kids, not 90% Black kids, or 80 or 90% Black and Latino kids. And so they haven't been really tested broadly in those contexts at scale. However, these over here, the deep engagement ones, those have been primarily tested in those contexts. Segregated schools, high poverty schools, disadvantaged parts of the community. So when you're thinking about where these interventions have been shown to be deployed with effectiveness, those on the left tend to be in more advantaged contexts. Those on the right tend to be deployed in more disadvantaged contexts. So in the more disadvantaged context, deeper engagement, longer duration, higher dosage is necessary versus what happens in more mixed contexts. Some caveats and considerations to leave you with before I close for questions. I don't know how far over time I am, brother, sorry. Meaning-based interventions are not a panacea, but reflect a powerful new paradigm of intervention. Not the least of which is because other interventions work better. They make kids seek other interventions in their context when you use meaning-based interventions. So altering meaning, altering how identity interacts with context is a particularly important area of work that we should emphasize if our goal is to close racial gaps in outcomes and to improve outcomes for Black, Latino, American Indian kids. Their effects are contingent on supportive environments, as I suggested earlier. If the environment is working against it, if the environment is communicating messages of non-belonging or signaling that you're not a good student, we know that, we're not here to educate you, we're here to contain you, then these types of interventions are not likely to have the effect that's desired. There are other contextual pieces that need to be in play, and there's research building out an understanding, a greater understanding of that. Right now, most of the prescriptions are very general. Self-affirmation interventions work better in better resource schools. They've mostly been tested in better resource schools, not the highly disadvantaged schools. Rites of passage programs and more intensive programs, including Pathways to Success, tend to work better for highly disadvantaged youth of color in high poverty schools. And I want to tell you one last thing that I took out of here because I didn't know how much time I was going to have. They did a study of, it was a few hundred, I think it was like 500 folks, and asked them, it was a largely white sample, and asked them about if we could get these types of amazing effects from these meaning-based interventions. If we administer a growth mindset intervention, you know we can improve math scores by this much. If we do a self-affirmation or belonging intervention, we can improve English or writing scores by this much. What they found is that when they told that to this largely white audience, it significantly decreased their support for any programs or any interventions that dealt with structural issues. So they're like, oh, if you can do that, then we don't need all the poverty spending. We don't need to equalize school spending. We don't need to reduce economic and racial segregation. We don't need to deal with incarceration. We don't need to deal with any of those things if you can just do a 1-hour intervention and improve academic outcomes. And so the sad irony here is that when we see how meaning matters and we try and target meaning directly, it can produce a counter blowback effect among people who will say, well, if you can do that, then you don't need all the other things you're asking for. So I just want to let you know that in terms of how I communicate the language of these interventions, they are not something that I would call game-changing, even though I think they represent a paradigm shift. But I don't want to oversell them for fear that folks might have this type of blowback effect on the work that we try and do. All right, and that's it. Thank you, everybody. Should I take questions, or is my time up?
You take a few.
Okay, any burning questions? Yes, sir. Yes, it's called the Handbook of Wise Interventions. Yes, sir. So, grit, conscientiousness is a long-standing, what's called one of the so-called big 5 personality traits. Personality traits are considered stable aspects of ourselves that develop early and kind of stay that way over time. Grit has been presented as kind of this malleable thing that if you implement a couple interventions, you can improve grit. What researchers have done is they've used different types of validity tests to try and determine whether or not grit is actually distinct from as a facet of conscientiousness that deals with perseverance. And when they've tested it in studies, they found that it doesn't differ that much. That grit actually just may be a new name for a personality trait that we've known about for most of the 20th century. And so the argument is that they say much ado about grit, old wine in new bottles, like these are the titles of these studies. One did a meta-analysis of several studies and came to the same conclusion. And so basically the argument is that grit is not something new and that we've tried interventions that try and influence personality traits with not much success. And so if you spend a lot of effort chasing grit, you may waste a lot of effort, basically, is the conclusion from some of those studies. Absolutely. Any other burning questions?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
So the last thing that you mentioned about how this can shift the way people think about how it should be funded, and I hear that it's both and. We're what you're bringing to the table is that meaning-based interventions are not a replacement of, but it's both and. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Continue doing what we're doing, also.
That's right.
Adding this onto it, and so what is the direction or like first steps that people can actually take based off the information you shared today back to their districts to begin to start thinking more concretely about how to have meaning-based interventions in their schools?
Yes. So the first thing is to familiarize yourself with what these interventions entail, because you'll be surprised at how non-complicated they actually are. But it's a door opener to the meaning journey, if you will. So if you look inside, which I've had a chance to do, is look inside SGLI's program and look inside Becoming a Man's program, there's a lot of meaning components in those models. There's a lot of different stuff that they've invented and created that are about influencing and changing meaning. My expectation is that as you start down the journey of understanding these models at a high level, that you will start to explore and identify new meaning-based interventions, new things that could be innovated within this paradigm of trying to influence the meaning kids are drawing about themselves and their identity in the context of their work. There's a lot of prescription in both. So there's a Handbook of Wise Interventions. There's another book that is about implementing these things in practice in schools with some school practitioners. And they have some helpful suggestions there for folks that are like practice-based work for those that are doing work on the ground. Hold on, let me do my little search here. It's called Belonging, Growth Mindset, and Resilience to Foster Student Success. That's another one that's written by folks who've kind of taken these ideas and tried to innovate and actualize within school settings. And so there's always going to be the model we implement with fidelity that was tested in RCT, and the stuff that we made up that sounds really good based upon those models. Both of those things need to happen. And I think the making up stuff, testing stuff, seeing how stuff works, especially because it's small footprint stuff. Like, what if we did this in a single session in class? Just did this exercise. And there's a lot of stuff out there. The key is to see what traction you're getting. We don't learn from all of these things. I think that's one of the first things, is to do some follow-up, to see if there's some effect. Do a randomization. Some kids get a certain thing that you're delivering, other kids get another one. Do your own experiment in your classroom and see at the end of the school year if there's differences. That type of stuff will advance the learning agenda around building this out. I don't think we should be limited to just those three that were tested. I don't even think the researchers who came up with those three think these are the only ways you can do this. But compared to what we have in academic skills and socio-emotional, we have a fairly limited number of innovative practices around meaning-based intervention. I want that to be a lot, and us be talking about what's the best amongst that list. Yes, sir, Mr. Weaver. I haven't followed the implementation journey of a lot of these. I've just looked at the studies that summarize them. So I'm not sure of what different places have confronted. They often don't report the actual school district that these studies were administered in. So I'd be curious of what plays out in the politics. How many red states have these versus blue states? So I actually don't know the answer to that. But you all are implementers, and so there's pushbacks I'm sure that you can share for this audience based upon your own experience. Yes, sir. That's right. Mm-hmm. Yes. I mean, this is absolutely about culture, but culture is a loaded term. Uh, yeah. Well, let me give you. I want you to convey the spirit of your question, and don't worry, I don't have.
No problem. So essentially, I was asking, like, what are the cultural implications of this type of work when we understand that a lot of our Black, Brown, or otherwise students, right? You come from different nations, different places, cultures, and so the impact of aligning this type of work outside and inside of our institutional systems, where it's essentially counterculture.
Absolutely. So if you look at Bloom, Brotherhood Crusades model, SGLI's model, Kingmakers of Oakland, cultural approaches are rife through them. But I call them meaning-based, because that's essentially what culture is about. The idea that because culture has been used as a cudgel, essentially, to oppress, in particular, Black folks and Latino folks for the past few decades, starting in particular during the 1980s, it was turned into the culture of poverty. This became a basis for so much marginalization and exclusion. I've always had a reticence to say, okay, we're teaching kids culture today, because it would play right into the naming games that the right has been using for a long time. When you talk about meaning, it feels less opaque to me. The interpretation of what's going on and how we're making meaning of our lives, all the cultural things are stories to convey meaning, and I feel like it can fit there without inheriting the baggage. And so that's why many of these, even though they're culturally based, especially rites of passage, I still define them as meaning-based. So that's my rationale, but you're absolutely right. Okay. Thank you, everybody.